Okay, welcome. Before we continue with today's session, it is so important that we do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Krusekopf and Lekwungen ancestors and families, the territories. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. Welcome. So to make sure everybody is in the right room today, today's session is all about attracting, developing, and engaging talent, the changing workforce. And we have a great panel today, and I'm going to welcome up the chair of the chamber, Chris Work, who is going to do the opening remarks. This is a collaborative webinar between Royal Roads University and the chamber. So welcome, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Mara, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. So I'd like to welcome everyone here today to this presentation. My name, as Mara mentioned, is Chris Work, and the incoming chair for the Chamber of Commerce. I think this webinar is really timely because of the amount of changes I think we've seen on how people work, expectations of employees, and then making sure employers are matching those. So I think also I think businesses have a really important part in our community. Strong businesses and successful local businesses through both their own efforts and their employees are able to make our city special. I think a strong business community lets us be able to give back to our community and have the arts, the sports, the community events that make Victoria and the surrounding areas great, Greater Victoria great. So with that, I'd just like to pass it along to our facilitator, Ross Porter, who'll be leading the session. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everyone. I think the strong number of registrations and attendance we have is indicative of just how much this topic is front and center for so many. It's certainly one of the top 3 topics that are on the minds of employers and executives that I'm in regular contact with. It's big, it's complex, and there's lots of competing and strongly held views and perspectives. David, Charles, and I will be drawing on our personal and our professional observations and insights and experiences. There's obviously limits to what we can cover in an hour, but our goal is to share some perspectives that may be new, maybe different, maybe less well understood or actively considered than others, and to offer up some ideas that you can take away and continue to reflect and build on post-session. And as time permits, we will invite your questions and comments. So with that said, let's get right into it. So David, you're a seasoned HR consultant. You've worked with lots of different small and medium businesses. I'm interested, what do you see as some of the key trends or issues, changes businesses or organizations writ large are grappling with and are increasingly impacting the workplace and the world of work?
Rob, there are about 6 key issues that I'll go into that I see playing out in the private sector on a regular basis. Amar, can we do poll 1 to start with? Just we'll get that going at the same time. So first, there's a huge management struggle. Many employers have struggled with attracting, retaining, compensating, motivating, and developing their employees. There has been fierce competition for employees in the workplace. Now, why is this? Is typically a question, what changed? Again, part of this goes back to the pandemic, a big reluctance of people to re-enter the workforce. A lot of people simply dropped out of the market. Some people refer to the Great Resignation. Some changing values, changing circumstances, but this was a benefit to a lot of employees as they started to look for new opportunities. They started to move around. Suddenly workers were in the driver's seat, so as to say, and they had a lot of power to renegotiate terms or to simply move on. Now, what may be changing quickly is the pendulum is starting to slowly swing back towards the middle. Second, the pandemic and post-pandemic challenges continue to linger. It's not over in some ways. Not so long ago, we were dealing with all kinds of public health measures, changing measures, safety precautions, just rapid changes in the workplace. This was a confusing and scaring period for a lot of workplaces, given that the pace of change. I suspect there's lots of hidden and not so hidden scars from this experience. Many employees are still exhausted or nearly burnt out or burnt out. In recent months, employees were still getting sick with various illnesses, influenza, RSV, COVID-19, and other ailments. The pandemic is both a traumatic and formative event that will shape future generations, in my opinion. New issues are emerging. There's a battle over work from home, hybrid, return to the office for many people. We have some employees with big vacation banks. They put in a lot of hours over the pandemic, and we have to manage this. Is it carryover, payout, or a lot of people on extra vacation this year? Something's got to give. Also, we have employees that weren't able to go overseas. So we have a lot of employees looking to go on long trips overseas to see family. And in some cases, if they don't get what they're looking for, they may be looking to leave the organization. So this is another difficult challenge that employers have to wrestle with. Also, what I'm seeing is we now have a lot of applicants looking for a second full-time job or a second part-time job. So that's something that I haven't seen as much in recent years. Now, coming back to remote work, because I think that's one of the big pressing topics that it's lingering in many places. I would call it, this is still an exciting battle that's unfolding. There's resistance for people returning to offices. Some workplace and occupations were better able to transition to work from home. Other people simply weren't as lucky, but there's lingering issues. Many employees like the work arrangement with no travel time, savings on transportation costs, and more control over their hours and activities. I suspect employers need to regain some control as they need to ensure productivity and team effectiveness. I think that's what's driving them. However, there's some hard questions on this issue still. What jobs or occupations are best suited for work from home or remote? Are employees as productive and efficient and effective remotely? How can employers monitor performance and productivity effectively and fairly, or is it simply a matter of trust? What is the performance standard? Is it a minimal effort, a fixed level of productivity, or is it a maximum effort? If an employee is more effective and safe from working from home and has fewer personal costs, and the employer has fewer business costs, why wouldn't an employer agree to a permanent arrangement? And, I think we get into the issue of, were productivity claims overstated or maybe not proven, but there's still something there that has to be sorted out. And I think we see that now in a number of industrial relations areas where big employers and big unions are wrestling with this issue because it's really important to people. Third thing I would say is, hidden below the surface, there's a lot of angry and frustrated people, given the high inflation, rising food costs, rising interest rates, growing insecurity over a looming recession. People are nervous and many are struggling. In the news, we're just starting to hear about significant scale layoffs in the tech sector and manufacturing. People are questioning rising costs and rising taxes. Workers are looking for wage increases, job security, and simple appreciation in some cases. It will be interesting to see how this plays out in 2023 as we potentially enter a recessionary period. Fourth, there's the continuing importance of generational issues in the workplace. We have 5 generations of workers: traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen X, Y, and Z, all sharing workplaces across Canada. This leads to some fascinating interpersonal and interwork dynamics on how work gets done, the soft skills, on preferences related to values, communications, training and development, problem solving, and the use of technology. We have an emerging Gen Z group. The eldest are now 22, and there's more of them entering the workforce each year. They're composed about 5% of the workplace, while the traditionalists, the youngest of whom are 78, have mostly exited the workforce. Baby boomers are now retiring, semi-retiring, or looking for new forms of post-retirement activities. And the oldest generation X are 58, and some of them are lining up to exit or to explore new opportunities. I think a question, number 5, a question for a lot of employers is, where are we going to find future workers? Young people are looking at it as, where are the jobs of the future? How do they prepare for them? The futurists are suggesting more automation, more robots, more AI, and more traditional forms of employment. People are still worried about offshoring jobs. Global competition is still in the back of people's minds. Where will people be working in decades to come? Lastly, there's a growing focus on workplace safety. which I think has been a positive change. For the last few years, employers and employees have been riveted to online news and TV for the latest information around pandemic statistics, hospital capacities, wastewater, other public safety measures. There's a new reflection on the quality of life, work-life balance, and dealing with mental health. Now, as we look at generations for a moment, as we look back at the poll, it's interesting to see that we have no traditionalists. We have 11% boomers. We have 53% Generation X, 36% millennials, and we have no Generation Z. So yeah, so we have a heavy Generation X group. So it's just interesting, you shake the bubble a little different way and you're going to get a different mix of people, but fascinating to see who we have with us today.
So let's pick up a little bit more on this, on the generational piece and the differences. So let's explore the changing generational makeup of today's workplace and why you think it's so important for businesses or organizations of any type to understand and appreciate the types of generational makeup and differences that are occurring and what it means for the future of work.
Sure. So for me, when I think about generational theory or generational cohort theory, as I like to call it, businesses and society, they understand this concept of generations. Proponents have used the framework in various ways, from marketing and managing communications during the pandemic. Earlier work was by Carl Maynham. Other work was Howe and Strauss on repeating generation models. But really, what is the key to generations? And the key is the allocation of time periods, determining formative or traumatic events. And as I mentioned earlier, it'll be interesting to see how the whole pandemic plays out in future generations. Is that how we shape one of the next generations? And then we get into sorting out values, experiences, and related factors that define these generations. For myself, with respect to some of my own research, I'm looking at the intersection of presenteeism and workplace safety by generational cohort. For me, I believe a better understanding of generational impacts on presenteeism safety, allowing employers to have an opportunity to better target their HR and health and safety programs. It allows them to prioritize what's important, to be able to better sell them, and to be able to ensure that they're more effective and they're getting the best bang for the buck. The results should be, and again, when I'm talking about presenteeism and reducing accidents, in particular, when I focus on generations, it should be reduced accidents, reduced employee harm, reduced employer costs, and improved productivity, and it should be a win-win-win for everyone. We know we have an aging workforce in Canada. There is a need for workers to stay in the workforce longer. Sometimes this is simply a labor demand issue. We need more people. And sometimes it's a family need, or it's reality of the individual person. A lot has changed from the days where people talked about Freedom 55. Research suggests there's links between age and deteriorating physical health and cognitive abilities. Further research suggests there's a link between age and workplace accidents. So for me, I believe generational theory is an important tool for better targeting information and making better use of programs by focusing on generations.
What's the relationship, say, between generations and the idea of life stages?
Well, I think there's some similarities with respect to, it's like any type of life cycle where you have different groups of people at different times. And for me, you have people, you can always talk about maturation theory, where, as people age, life experiences change, life requirements change, people are different. And, essentially the core element of generational cohort theory is the idea that people in different groups have different needs, different requirements, identify in different ways. And, that's how do you segment and target to people? Generations is one of those tools.
I think I could already anticipate one of the implications is we have to get away from this one size fits all approach to HR practices or management practices generally. So how we segment and think of our workforce, whether it's by job, whether it's by business unit, by location or generation or life stage, there are different needs and expectations at work.
Right. And I think, I think that's probably one of the key things is there's always that debate in any workforce. Do you treat everybody exactly the same, or do you customize? And sometimes you have to be careful of those customizations too, right?
Right. The unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I understand there was a recent article that you read through CBC News that talked about working with millennials that really kind of caught your attention, because so much of the discussion around generations, at least in my world, has been talking about millennials. So can you talk about why this article kind of struck a chord with you, and what points stood out for you?
Sure. It was a Saturday morning, relaxing, looking at the news online, reading through it, and sure enough, a topic related to my research pops up. And basically the article was entitled "How to Work with Millennials," and had to do with a course being offered to the Senate of Canada and their employees. And I literally watched it unfold as hundreds of people commented on it. And I was kind of going, this is surprising that it's so interesting, that it's commanding so much attention, and that there's so much passionate response to it. So I looked at it and, in a less formal way, trying to take out points from I think it was 503 comments that pretty rapidly arose before they cut it off. I was amazed that some people actually had their comments deleted, but when I looked at it, there was about 6 main themes and a few smaller themes.
Okay.
So first theme was a lot of people angry at the idea of the Senate or their employees taking these courses, and just anger and hostility. Then there was an attack on millennials. And the attack really focused on a couple of key points. One was the suggestion that, well, they're too delicate, they're not resilient. It's kind of that participation trophy culture. No one fails, great inflation. I think somebody even used the word adult toddlers. Somebody said lazy and entitled. Now, they're not my views. I'm just quoting. I'm just quoting for the record what was said. And just, even comments about people living in parents' basement, distracted by tech, entitled praise seekers, woke, sensitive personalities. These were words that I think triggered a lot of other responses and a lot of defenses. And, somebody would argue that, okay, this was an article on a certain platform. Had I gone and done the same article on Reddit, it probably would have been a younger audience, right, responding very differently. So I think we have to remember, where we're getting the data from. Now, for me, it was interesting. It was about a 50-50 split on people who supported and opposed the training. There's some people, generational differences should be taught, and it makes sense if you want to maximize productivity in the workplace. However, there was an equal group of people who kind of said, hey, you know what? You can't deal with other people. You should just be fired, or other hostile answers. For me, it was interesting that you did have a group of people that kind of had a more balanced approach that said, hey, yep, millennials are okay. Some are good, some are bad. And then you get into, okay, well, what was this group of people thinking? Now, the people who were suggesting good and bad, some positive values are, work-life balance, health, technology, more tolerant of differences in people, more of a desire for social change. Some questioning, current system is rigged. Again, there were some negative responses as well. Some people suggesting millennials are full of themselves, have an entitlement attitude, quietly quit, or doing the bare minimum. And again, my point in raising this, good and bad, is that the idea of people are grouping people in a certain way, and we need to be aware of that. And smart employers, in my view, they're using this information to manage their workplace. Now, two other interesting themes were, sometimes you look at, well, who's to blame for this? And it was interesting to see that, there's a lot of pushback on, okay, this goes back to parenting style, or it's our schools that failed us. I'm not sure of that, but it was just interesting where, when somebody starts pointing the finger, it goes around pretty quick. Also, there was questioning from a number of people about, when we talk about these generalizations and stereotypes, is this even the right thing to do? Because there can be some harm from such generalizations. And then on the other side of the coin, there are people saying, well, yeah, you do generalize in life, and there's learning to be had from generalizations, and it's not unfair to do these type of groupings. So it was interesting to see that. Some secondary themes that I also thought were fun and interesting was, there was resistance amongst millennials to the idea that they're even young. There's some, and the argument can be made is that the oldest millennials are now 42, not really young anymore. And then the other side of the coin is, yeah, but there's still some that are 23. So there's questions about, does a 23-year-old and a 42-year-old, are they in different places in life?
Yeah.
So, and that's
that was my life stage comment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. Then we get into, ideas around, does one generation own something like quality of life? Or is that something that's kind of transverse between several generations? Not a new concept. Many people will argue that, the Gen X started that trend. Other people say, no, that's really Gen Y or millennials. So that's interesting. And another theme that kind of weaves itself through a lot of the posts is the whole topic around technology. Or is it the millennials that own the smartphone or Gen Z? I always kind of laugh when I look at technology because I have older siblings, and they can fix a truck. They can listen to it and tell you what's wrong with the truck. I can't do that. I can fix a PC. Couldn't fix a smartphone. So again, I think that, is it learning over time? Is it the tools you get used to? I think there's something there when we talk about technology. Yeah. Now, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, okay, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, I was just going to say that, there was a couple, like if I just had to pull out 3 comments of the 503 that, kind of impressed me or I thought were worthy of sharing. I just, one comment was, millennials don't want praise. They want to be paid fairly and live comfortably with the pay they get, like the generations before them. It's not fair that I'm not sure if that's boomers or Gen X, but somebody pulled the ladders up and then acted like they shouldn't complain.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of hit me. Another one that I thought was fun and true, and I think maybe we all do this a little bit, consciously or not so consciously. Somebody had wrote, plenty of millennials make fun of older people in the workplace and call them dinosaurs. It goes both ways.
Right.
So I think there's probably a little bit of tongue in cheek or humor in this when it's not taken too seriously, but we need to be aware of that side, that we don't want people being hurt over this either, right? And then the third comment I would share is, somebody had written, again, these aren't my words, but I like them. I do not believe that any one generation is better than the next, because we have all had our strengths and our weaknesses. We've all had to walk different paths and endure different hardships. Those differences, they've given us a different perspective and outlook on how things are and how things should be. I see strength in having so many diverse views regarding any of the challenges we face as a society. And I accept that every generation has its self-entitled me first personalities. which makes sense,
well
I think.
Said. Yeah.
Right?
There's some interesting comments and questions that have been posted as you've been chatting. One was just, again, the role of stereotypes, us being aware of the stereotypes that we are using as filters. Somebody said a heuristic, kind of a shorthand to be able to kind of navigate the complexity of the workplace and expectations and needs and whatnot. And then there's the piece around how we stereotype based on fear. Or the threat that we feel by others in the workplace, and that was a theme that it was also captured in that article around the role of stereotypes and the damaging effects that stereotypes can have. Any comments on kind of just the role of stereotyping, especially around generations?
Well, so 2 things. One is, I think I think we have to use things intelligently with a grain of salt, to use that expression. I think we have to realize that, not everybody fits perfectly in a box. And I always, I like what it says in the literature, when it talks about, there's fuzzy boundaries around generations. And I think there's cases where people simply don't fit in a box. And I think we have to be cognizant that it isn't a everybody within that group is exactly the same. And I think we want to be conscious that, we're not making negative comments that hurt other people. We use it in a positive way.
Another piece, just circling back to your comments around health and safety, both pre and post COVID, and how that's changing. Any comments on what you're seeing on the mental health front, either from a generational perspective or otherwise?
Well, I think it's really hit all generations, but I think there is research that will show that it affected different generations differently.
Mm-hmm.
I would see that I think younger people were particularly affected. I think what will be really interesting is, what is that long-term impact on those people? I think when we talk about the next generation, the children that were in high school, or, their whole education was disrupted. I'm not sure if online learning was as effective as regular learning. I'm not sure that, shutting people in and that isolation that some people experienced, I'm not sure how that will play out. But I think we did mobilize as a society a lot of resources to help people deal with these mental health issues. But at that same point in time, society was pretty focused on the physical health issues. So there was a lot of competition, right?
Yeah, I think my sense is that employers, executives, managers are becoming much more alive to things that are affecting how people are showing up, and I think they're grappling with that. What is the appropriate response? Okay, we might circle back to some of these themes and others as we proceed, but I want to kind of shift to Charles, building on this generational piece. Charles, talking about how do we more effectively engage different generations. I know you have a long-standing interest in folks in the later stages of their career and life, and tell us about the opportunity that you see that presenting.
Yeah, thank you. And, very interesting discussion. It brings up the issue of the different generations. I know. So I'm at the very end of my Gen X generation. I was always jealous because my brother is the youngest of the baby boom generation. So somehow we're in different generations, even though just a couple of years apart. But yeah, the issue that I wanted to talk about is partly because of my role. So I've been the program head of our mid-career MBA program at Royal Road. So that's a program, blended program where people are working full-time, and the average age of people in the program is probably 40, but that's an age range of people in that program. And as well, I did the executive coaching program at Royal Roads and had a cohort of people as well who were sort of in that age range and a little bit older. And we started having a lot of discussions, and I talk a lot with my students about, well, why do you come back? Why do you come back to school? And there was a comment about, how can train people, and why do people go back to school at the mid and later stages of their career? And it's interesting because people talk about wanting to make a change. That's a core piece. A lot of people get into a space where they're really interested in making a change. And I'll say for myself, for example, as I reach my later 50s and I think, okay, I've been doing what I've been doing, working at Royal Roads now for almost 20 years. Okay, I want to try something new, whether that's within my organization or looking at other opportunities or just doing something a little bit different. And when I talk to a lot of my peers, I hear that from people that people are really interested in making a shift. Alongside that, and so I started reading and doing a lot of work in this area. And one of the things when you start reading in this area, you start looking at the demographics, for example. So there are far more, and this is particularly prevalent in Victoria. And one of the themes, and as we were talking about this session, I was saying, for example, Victoria sort of has positioned itself, and we have our ocean hub, and we have certain things that we're identifying. It's interesting to me that they haven't identified something that was very prevalent from the time I moved to Victoria and then continuing on, and that is we have this really wealth of talent of people in the sort of mid and later stages in their career and early retirement years, and are we effectively tapping into that talent within the local workforce? And so this is in the context of, for example, if people know the 100-year life and this idea that people are living much longer lives, much healthier lives, people want to stay engaged. I live here in Machosen. My neighbors, are often in their 70s, 80s, and they're all off biking and hiking and doing all kinds of really interesting things around. And they really want to stay engaged. And many of them work, and there's the volunteering and doing different things. But a lot of people want to remain engaged in the workforce. And remaining engaged in the workforce has been shown to have so many health benefits. There's benefits for society. And when we look at the BC Jobs Plan, for example, which just came out, and they consider, thinking about how we're going to meet this need for 1 million new jobs over this time period. When we start looking at the demographics, 25% of workers are already over the age of 50. And so people often think about them retiring or leaving the workforce. But I think a key question or issue is, how can we keep people in the workforce? How can we keep people engaged in the workforce? And there are a lot of barriers and different things. And we've been thinking about this and then starting to talk about, what are some different approaches. And I've been doing a lot of reading and working with several other universities on how we can create programs and things within the universities, or how can companies address this issue?
Why do you think that it hasn't necessarily garnered the same attention as the challenge of attracting younger folks? Why haven't we been thinking as much about folks in the later stage of the career, either extending their career or re-engaging them in some capacity? As you said, Victoria has so many incredibly accomplished people that maybe have moved here from other places that are trying to figure out, to your point about how to stay engaged, but it doesn't seem to be as much part of the conversation. Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
Why it's not part of the conversation? I think in some ways there are some things that just happen organically. People do find ways to continue to work and engage, but I think there's a lot of structural pieces within society, within companies and organizations. When you start looking at it, ageism is something that is very prevalent. When you look at, there's a lot of talk about how recruiting practices within organizations, for example, will automatically screen out, older people as they're looking for jobs, and some of the AI and the tools of screening resumes, you're just not going to, because you're not a candidate who fits a profile that maybe has been posted for a position or that people consider as traditional of coming from university or coming from an earlier stage and sort of moving up in your career. What about people who have been a vice president in an organization and they're just looking to do something different, but they don't want that same level of responsibility? So our workforce and our organizations are just not really set up to think about how people can shift careers in ways that remain meaningful and purposeful for them and for organizations, but that, are sort of what would be considered non-traditional movements. And I'll give universities, though, as an example of something that I think has some elements that be interesting to explore in the wider workforce. And that's, for example, we have systems where, there's phased retirement where you can do your retirement over a number of years. So you teach a fewer classes, or you do fewer things over time, or the whole emeritus faculty idea where even after you're fully retired from your current role, you retain your affiliation, and that's an affiliation in terms of we can come back and teach occasionally. You retain your email, your title, your affiliation with the university, and so it's a way that you hold, still a position and respect within that position, but then you're able to stay engaged with the organization as well and find new roles.
Yeah. So, what are building on that, some strategies or approaches that you think more organizations need to be considering to engage and utilize the energies and experiences of folks that are at a different stage of that later stage of their career?
Yeah, and I think, one thing to think about, and there's a lot of interesting work on this, is around, what are people looking for? And, it's a whole big diverse set of things that different people are looking for. One interesting area is around entrepreneurship. And it's interesting because there's so much focus on entrepreneurship by people in their 20s, they're all excited, they have this new idea, but they don't have all of the things that people who are in the, 40s, 50s, 60s have in terms of the networks, the experience, the access to resources, the ability to try. And they've actually find that entrepreneurs who are older are actually more successful than entrepreneurs at an early stage, which is an interesting thing. And then you have different people, and people are in different spaces. I mean, some people need to keep working. As we say, as we contemplate a 100-year life, as they say, traditional retirement models, and whether that's saving for retirement or thinking about retirement, sort of go out the window, because it's not, you can't work long enough to save. So if you're going to retire at 60 and live to 100, well, do you have enough resources for the next 40 years? And so some people, are required or need to keep working longer. And some people have the luxury, one would say, of well, I have enough resources and assets. So I want to find meaningful work, but I don't really have to work, or I have some choice about the types of positions and roles and that. And so, I mean, you were saying earlier about different things. It's interesting. They talk about older workers as the ultimate gig workers, because in fact, older workers are people who actually are quite interested often in gig work. They want to be able to have flexibility. They're often engaged in different types of caregiving, the kids, grandkids, even parents now, again, living to much older. I know a lot of people, their parents are still living, even though they've retired themselves. And so people want flexibility within their work life, and able to be able to do those different things. And that extends through, for different reasons, through people's full work life. But I think it's something that's very important if you want to retain workers and in that sort of later stages of people's careers.
Do we want to use we talked about maybe having a poll in terms of whether folks are they doing anything on the older worker front? So we had that first question around, does your organization have any programs or policies to recruit? And it'd be kind of interesting how much this is on the radar screen for our attendees. So Amara is just going to bring up a poll question, just we can riff off of that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that I'm quite interested in. I'm quite interested in engaging with people. And it's interesting, I saw some people from the UVic co-op and internship, for example. So one idea that's been put forward is creating late career internships. And I was just talking with my MBA students who happen to be on campus for a residency right now about, well, would you be interested in an internship? And it's interesting, they're all working full-time in different companies or organizations, and about half of them said, yes, absolutely, I'd be really interested. Now, it could be tricky in terms of trying to negotiate the time off or different things, but they're very interested in internships. Part of it is, well, maybe exploring a new industry or new opportunity. Part of it is just trying something different. And I know I have a friend who's worked for Intel, for example, and Intel is a company that has sabbaticals for people. So every, I think 6 or 7 years, you can take 3 to 6 months and go do something else. And they actually find that really re-energizes people, whether that's that you want to do something, recreational that you've always wanted to do, or it can be that you go and engage with another organization.
So I see some poll results coming up, and clearly the lion's share of folks here, there aren't things that are necessarily targeting this part of the workforce. About 70% said no, only about 10% yes, and some folks are not so sure. So clearly we've identified an area of opportunity that has probably not been on people's radar screen. They're focusing on that entry-level, younger worker, important part of the challenges that so many employers are facing. But then there's the whole piece at the back end that we've just been talking about. So there's an invitation for more of us to be thinking about what that looks like inside of an organization. The other question was, is age diversity a component of your organization's diversity, equity, inclusion strategy? And again, not the majority. So there's maybe more attention, more conversation that needs to be given around the role of age in the workplace. Any surprises there in terms of the poll results?
Not really, because that's, I mean, particularly around sort of deliberate policies. And so I've been looking, for example, for policies for people, companies that have set up deliberate policies in this area. And when you look, there's a few like Unilever that get highlighted, but there's not really a lot of companies that have come forward. There's a movement, there's a number of companies that have done some interesting things around, for example, women who've been out of the workforce primarily, or people who have been out of the workforce as caregivers, often coming back into the workforce after some gaps in their career. And so a number of large companies have created specific programs to help people within that stage. I think you could do something similar for people at the later stage of their career. And there's a lot of lessons learned around that, it's better to bring in a group of people so that they can support each other. It needs to be something where people, in a way, it's both sides trying something out. And so, as you say, I think there's a lot of people at a later stage of their career who have a lot of management experience, for example, within their organization, but they're really unsure. And I hear a lot, for example, with the tech industry in town, and maybe it's partly a generational thing. I started off with the floppy disks and the old computers and all, and I hear, oh, well, we really need workers within the tech industry in Victoria and elsewhere. And there's a lot of people within my age cohort who would say, we have a lot of management experience, but what could we do? We don't know what you need. And I think for many tech companies where most of the workers there would be much younger than you, and there's the movie with Robert De Niro and the intern, that sort of element, which is, sort of funny, but there's some truth to it. And it got mentioned here about multi-generational learning. And so there is starting to be a growing movement and some studies and things around what are the benefits of multi-generational, workplaces and multi-generational sharing. And because they talk about the sharing, we often think of, oh, I could go into the organization, be a mentor to other people. But what they find is, in fact, it's really a two-way thing, because, the younger people, these younger generations, have a lot to teach older workers and older generations as well. It's not just a one-way piece. And so, but having that diversity of workers could be a really beneficial thing, and something that organizations, as we said, with their diversity strategies and thinking about and really leaning into the idea that this is something we need to have on our radar.
I wonder how it connects to the notion of lifelong learning. And I know that the other thing that's on a lot of people's minds are upskilling, reskilling, better equipping their workforce, regardless of generation, for the things that are before them and the things that are coming. I was just thinking about how we can better utilize that intergenerational exchange of ideas and perspectives to support the differing needs and expectations from ongoing learning and development. There's things that the younger generation can share with the older and vice versa. Other thoughts you have around how do we support people from a learning and development perspective throughout their career? I know that the other kind of passion topic you have is around kind of continuous or lifelong learning and how we can better support that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so one is just in the broader lifelong learning. It's something that's very interesting, and one thing that I've looked a little bit at, and it's actually interesting to me that there's not more exploration of it in the university or sort of formal education space, and that is something like subscription-based learning. So that why don't we have something so that people can go back and get learning at different stages, any age, any stage is what they say. So at different stages of your career, you need different types of learning and different opportunities. The government in the UK, it's very interesting, it's probably also brought up, they've had some challenges in terms of their workforce, but they actually have a much more organized system where they're looking at ways that they can give people lifelong learning grants and other ways that they can engage people so that they can continue and get training opportunities later on. If you think of our university structure, it's very, very focused, and colleges are very focused on younger people. The age structure, other than the faculty and some of the staff, right? But if you think of your clients, Like, why is that? Why is that we think of learning as something that happens? Oh, I went to university in my 20s. Maybe I go back and get a master's in my 30s, but then you're going to work for another 40 years and everything's changing around you. How can you provide that education? So I think there's a lot that could be done, and there's a group of universities called age-friendly universities, and there's a couple in BC. UBC Okanagan just joined, and a few others in Canada. I think that's something to think about. How do you create an environment and programs that would talk with people? And then there's another area of programs, and this is what I'm really excited about and quite interested in, is there's an area of programs that they call kind of midlife transition programs or purpose programs. And this is sort of started and led by some of the big US universities. Harvard, Stanford, Notre Dame have these programs. But I'm on a committee with a number of people from there and other universities that are looking at how can we spread these programs. So the Stanford program, which is sort of, wouldn't it be wonderful? And that is that you go back to school in a cohort, say 30 or 40 people who are also in that sort of 50, 60 age range. You go back for 1 year, you can take any class you want on campus. So whatever your sort of learning interests and needs are, you can take a class and it's undergraduate or graduate level. You then go to the classes, it's non-credit, so you don't have to take all the tests, but you can just really learn anything. So one of the things with that is, like, my daughter was signing up for her university classes and my wife and I are looking over her shoulder and saying, wow, that class looks interesting. That class, wouldn't that be great? And some of that's, there are continuing studies and some types of learning that it's just learning for interest's sake. But a lot of people are using these programs to actually say, okay, well, what I've always wanted to do is start a program to help, refugees find jobs and meaningful work. And so how can I do that? So I want to go to the business school and learn a bit about nonprofit management, and maybe I want to get some other work with another department in the university, and build my own personalized program, but tap into the resources. We know, being on a university campus, there's tremendous knowledge and resources and connections through the people on campus and of the alumni networks, et cetera. So universities are starting to look at this and say, well, that's interesting because there's a declining demographic of students. There's far more people in the 55 plus age within the Victoria region or even within Canada than there are in the 0 to 20 age range. And so how can we do some of that where universities create programs that are intentional programs for people to come back? You're in a cohort, which is very important. You're going through a transition in your life and working with other people who are in a similar stage and working through that, both academically getting some things, but also personally, where you're doing autobiography writing and other things, and sort of, what do I want to do? Because many people hit this stage in life where they say, well, what is it I want to, I have this opportunity. What is it that I want to do? And that's where then pairing that with the needs of organizations and companies. And one program that I thought is interesting, the University of Connecticut has started a program for later stage managers who want to become nonprofit managers, for example. So they may be from a government or an organization, they have some management experience, but then they can go back and do 6 months of nonprofit training and get an internship and get paired up with a nonprofit that needs people to work, whether that's in finance or different things. And so it's a really interesting way that, again, you stay engaged, but you shift careers, you shift gears into something different or something new. And it doesn't have to be nonprofits, as I say, it could be the tech industry, or it could be another industry that is looking for people.
Mayor, can you bring David onto the screen as well? I have more of an open conversation around now. And folks, if there are things that are on your mind that you're curious in posing or commenting on, continue to do so. I'm interested on a couple of other fronts. There was a really interesting piece I read recently, and there was an associated podcast from the Harvard Business Review, talking about employee value propositions. And what's really front and center for a lot of folks is responding to changing expectations around flexibility and flexible work arrangements, which we talked about a little bit, as well as pay, front and center because of inflation and other considerations. So they talk about these kind of like material goods or material offerings, and that so many employers are spending inordinate amount of time right now trying to address that issue. But we need to also be thinking about kind of the mid to longer term wants, needs, expectations of people in the workplace. So building on what Charles is talking about, opportunities for growth and development. What does that look like? What does that look like for people at different life stages and in different generations? The sense of connection and community. What are we doing about that? How much care and consideration are we giving that right now in light of the focus on more material matters? And then this other piece around meaning and purpose, that hasn't gone away. In fact, I sense that people are recalibrating and rethinking about what meaning and purpose and the role of work plays, and it's influencing the decisions they're making about how they show up in the workplace, what their expectations are, how they're articulating their needs and wants, and how employers are responding or not. Because my sense is that so many employers have been focusing on just getting through the difficult times over the last number of years, that the conversation around what's this all for? What do we stand for? What is our identity and direction as an organization? We can't lose sight of that, because that's what holds people in. Once their material needs are addressed, they're considering things like growth and development, connection and community, and meaning and purpose. Any comments or reflections on any of that, or anything else that we've been talking about? We have a few minutes left, so I just want to create some space to circle back to anything or build on anything that we've talked about.
So from my end, just a quick perspective as we talk about, the values of employees. I think a lot of employees are now walking with their feet. So if they don't feel aligned with an organization, they're not engaged, and these are going to be people who leave your organization quicker. And, I think the other side of that is employers have an opportunity. If you really want engaged people, well, you need to be aligned with your employees, and they need to be aligned with you. You want people that are engaged, excited about the workforce. I think just on a slightly different topic for a moment, I think a challenge is employers are promoting learning and development in a very big way. Employees want it. I think there's sometimes a little bit of balancing with respect to the cost of some of those opportunities. And then I think a larger challenge is we do have a lot of people that are, I'll say, credentially loaded. They have high academic backgrounds. They have a lot of experience. They have a lot of formal training. And sometimes the market, isn't really allocating those resources wisely. So you do have a lot of underemployment, and there's a lot of other challenges related to that.
Yeah, I was just listening to an interview with the CEO of LinkedIn, and about the whole idea of rethinking qualifications. A bit of a flip on what you were saying. Conversations I've been having recently is saying we can't find people. We need to say, what filters or criteria are we using that we need to revisit and say, is this really needed? So in the conversation with the CEO of LinkedIn, and obviously there's a self-interested element to this, but the emphasis on skill development versus degrees or pedigrees or networks that we've used as primary filters for whether or not you're qualified, and that we need to be revisiting that and say, what about demonstrated ability, and how are we accounting for that, and how are we accounting for ongoing learning and development, which we talked about as you age. And I think there's been too much emphasis on courses and workshops and seminars, really kind of traditional ways of learning and development. And we need to be focusing more on the job learning and projects and ways that people, I think it's just more sticky learning. And then revisiting this whole piece around what is a qualification, and this emphasis on skills versus traditional forms of education. Charles, I noticed that you were looking maybe at some of the comments or questions. Anything there that we should revisit?
I didn't see right away anything that just jumped. There's a few things. There's a few interesting topics that are a little bit separate. There is an interesting thing. It relates to the generational piece around And this is particularly prevalent in a place like Victoria, I think, with the generational gap for example, with housing prices and assets. I think one reason, of course, that people at the later stages of their careers, for example, feel more comfortable is if you're in the housing market here a long time ago and you've floated up to the top, there's a lot of people that feel like, okay, well, I have quite a few assets. Whereas the younger generation is feeling like, how can I ever get into this market? And we know that a big piece of that the opportunity for people to get into the market is through parents. And if your parents don't have that opportunity, but that's kind of a side topic, but it does part of that, part of how generational gaps see workplaces in a different way.
Well, I sense, I have more of a sense of conversations with some employers locally that say, okay, yeah, there's some challenges around figuring out this remote work piece, but what opportunities presented is to be able to engage talent further afield than necessarily having them located in Victoria for the reasons that you've said, or Vancouver, or any other expensive metropolitan area. Is we can have those people part of our team, but they don't actually have to be located at the head office location or another office location. They can otherwise be engaged. And maybe that's one of the other advantages that thoughtful forms of flexible work arrangements are enabling in terms of attracting and retaining talent. I'm aware that we're up against kind of the top of the hour. I want to thank Charles and David. I want to thank all the attendees and the comments and questions you've been posing. You are going to get a copy of the recording. This is obviously just a quick dive into a range of related topics around attracting, retaining, and developing talent. My hope is that you're leaving with a pebble in your shoe that will continue to provoke some new ways of thinking and working for you and for others. And perhaps we'll see many of you another time on another related topic. Mary, you had some closing pieces.
And I mean, I'll just say as well, like, I'm happy to, if anyone is interested in continuing the discussion, reach out. We're here and happy to connect. If you're not right in Victoria, virtually, or if you're in Victoria, set up a coffee, or let's just continue to talk. Because I think this issue, for example, how can we utilize this cohort, this real asset within Victoria, and then what are ways that companies and universities, for example, can work together to retrain people and make sure that people are working in the workforce is something that I think is a really good partnership. And we're open to ideas and your thoughts, because we're on the education side, but you guys are out there in the employment side.
Thank you. And I really want to thank our panelists today. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, David. And thank you to our facilitator, Ross. Really appreciate the dialogue and all of the comments in the chat. Thank you to all of our guests today. If you want to try using the reactions feature and give everybody a round of applause, that's fun. Or you can do a little party emoji. But thank you all today for showing up. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the Chamber for helping spread the word about this webinar. So this webinar today was brought to you from Royal Roads University and the School of Business. So here are some of our programs that we do offer through the School of Business. We have everything from our undergraduate programs, Bachelor of Commerce and Entrepreneurial Management, a Bachelor of Business Administration and Innovation and Sustainability, Master of Global Management, MBA in Executive Management, and a Doctor of Business Administration. And a lot of our programs are designed so that you can continue working while going to school. So that way you don't have to give up your job. As we know here, many of you are employed within the Greater Victoria community, and you can still get your degree. And I also want to just thank you all again. If you have any questions, you can reply to the email that I send out later. I can forward it to the right people. If you have any questions about our programs, let me know. You can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. And once again, hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day today. Thank you for joining us.